Danielle Hyder is a learning specialist in the Center for Student Success at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. Beacon is America's first accredited college or university dedicated to educating students with learning and attention issues. Hyder is also a certified rehabilitation counselor who served as a vocational rehabilitation counselor with the Florida Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. Marissa Manzanares is a licensed creative arts therapist in private practice in Brooklyn, New York, who specializes in neurodivergence in children and adults. Manzanares, who is neurodivergent, is an elected member of the Community Education Council for District 14 in Brooklyn, where she largely advocates for mental health and educational supports for neurodivergent students, with wins including helping 5 schools in her district create sensory rooms for students. Dr. Stephen Shore is a clinical associate professor of special education at Adelphi University in New York. Shore has spoken about autism at over 1,000 conferences around the world in his experience of being a professor on the spectrum. He has served as a media expert for outlets including ABC News, the BBC, Newsweek, and CNN, among others, and authored or co-authored 3 books, including Understanding Autism for Dummies, as well as creating book chapters on neurodivergent issues. And we're going to start our conversation with Danielle. So from your experience, Danielle, what are the unique challenges neurodivergent children face in forming relationships and friendships?
Well, thank you for this question. This is certainly a important question. So it's important to recognize that everyone, including children who are neurodivergent, we're meant to live in community and have social networks. So, however, depending upon the diagnosis, some neurodivergent children might have difficulties in understanding social cues and boundaries. They might have difficulties in understanding conflict resolution. Or they might even too become overstimulated depending upon social environments that they might find themselves in. And then certainly there's a lot of different scenarios depending upon each individual child. But some common difficulties that I've heard about is just being able to stay focused when conversing with others, expressing their feelings, and then also discerning how much to share and who to share with. These are just some of the common ones that I've heard of, and certainly, as I said, it can definitely vary depending upon each child in their own circumstances.
All right. So Marissa, how can parents and caregivers recognize the signals and signs that their children are experiencing loneliness?
Yeah, well, this is a great question because I'm sure it's top of mind for most parents. And so what I would say is the first and most important thing is that each parent, whether your child is neurodiverse or not, understands your child's sensory profile. So many of the things that Danielle was just speaking about, difficulty reading social cues, knowing how to pay attention during a conversation, environmental overstimulation, all of those things come from dysregulation of the sensory system. And so if you know your child and their sensory profile well, then you're going to understand their baseline. And you want to understand their baseline so that if and when the time comes that you are worried about some level of social isolation or loneliness, you can notice, are they kind of just being them and they're on their baseline, but something's going on developmentally? Or is this not really who they are and they are off their baseline and we're starting to worry about that, right? So number one, really understanding their sensory profile and their baseline and patterns, right? So every neurodivergent person is extremely unique, like all human beings, and we all have our patterns. Some of us are extremely social and active, but might still feel lonely, while others might isolate more. And so again, you really always kind of want to make sure that they're on their own spectrum of what's normal for them. And if there's anything outside of that, you'll want to figure out, is this something that's going on that's developmental, social, emotional? And if you're really not sure, then at the end of the day, depending on the age of your child, you always just want to ask in a way that's socially appropriate, and maybe also seek the guidance of a health professional. But at the end of the day, again, we tend to get very sensory dysregulated, and that can manifest in all many different types of ways. And so things you'll want to look for are obviously things like isolating, but also if your child tends to be somebody who's more quiet and likes more alone time, that might not necessarily be a marker for loneliness or isolation.
So, Dr. Shore, we know that neurodivergence comes with many different diagnoses, and I'm wondering whether there are distinct aspects of loneliness that impacts children who have a diagnosis of ADHD versus autism versus dyslexia, etc.
Well, I think what is most important is to understand the profile of the individual. As Marissa just mentioned, you were talking about sensory profiles, and you're also talking about emotional profiles, cognitive profiles, what the person is interested in. And I think what is most important is to understand what are the strengths of the individual. What do they like to do? And then once we know that, we can work with the person's abilities in which to find others who have similar interests and develop a sense of belonging. And I think that's key. It's developing a sense of belonging, because we'll find people who are autistic, for example, and some may be extroverts. Often we think of people with autism as being introverts. However, I know many autistic people who are extroverts. And because autism is a study of extremes, it's sort of like they're extroverts on steroids. So then we need to work with that. There are others who may be more shy, and we may need to find some strategies, as we will with the extrovert, on how to best interact with others. And likewise with ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurodivergent conditions, it's a matter of understanding that person's particular profile and working with that.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. So, Danielle, is there any connection between masking and loneliness in children with learning differences?
The short answer to this is yes. So masking is when a child or someone will essentially hide certain characteristics of their diagnosis. And we often see this in higher concentrations with women versus men. However, we have to be able to explore why someone is going to mask. And typically, someone masks because they are wanting to feel accepted, and they feel like they have to mask. So that's social conformity and social pressure. So with that, there are definitely things that parents and caregivers will want to take a look at. So because one of the things is that when you mask, right, you're not necessarily presenting your authentic self, right? Which can lead not only to loneliness and just feeling that sense of rejection, but then it can also feel like burnout, present as burnout, exhaustion. And then the other part of that too is that it can also begin to impact a child's mental health. And when it begins to do that, and parents start to see their child might feel more agitated, or they might see that they are observing behaviors that are kind of out of their baseline, right? So with that, a parent's going to want to first sit down and talk with the child themselves and see if they even recognize what they're actually doing. And then certainly they might also want to chat with their teachers and see if there's a behavioral pattern going on. But if masking begins to lead to burnout, exhaustion, all those typical things that might happen with that, and it begins to also impact their activities of daily living, then they might want to seek out some assistance from a mental health provider, or even a social support group to be able to help provide that child with being able to have that balance and understanding how they can present themselves authentically in a way that is healthy.
Thank you. So, Marissa, piggybacking off of what Daniel just mentioned, how important is it for parents and the therapists to address underlying mental health and anxiety issues alongside loneliness when you're dealing with neurodivergent children?
It's the most important thing. You know, first of all, everybody on the planet has a sensory system, right? And part of what makes us neurodivergent is that our sensory system can just kind of get a little dysregulated easier. And so that is why we tend to be prone to things like anxiety, depression, hyperactivity, because our bodies themselves can very easily become dysregulated. And if we don't, teach the body how to kind of integrate itself and be more regulated from a very early age, and then also cognitively and behaviorally teach, hey, this is your body, this is how your body works. Anxiety is a normal part of the human experience, and you are going to feel uncomfortable sometimes, but this is how you soothe it. Those are really key, important things that are so much easier to be taught and learned from a child from a young age, because our brains and our bodies are so pliable and we can learn very quickly, as opposed to trying to do that when you're an adult. And so, one thing we do know is that if you are on the spectrum, if you have ADHD or any other type of experience on the neurodiversity scale, so to speak, you're definitely going to have a very sensitive sensory system. And that is the seat for our emotions, right? So we want to make sure we are kind of noticing and targeting anxiety in very young children, particularly anxiety, but also there can be depression at times. But in general, if you don't also treat the mental health and the physiological emotional experience that people who are neurodivergent have, then you're really not focusing on one of the biggest underlying things that is the neurodivergent experience.
All right, well, thank you, Marissa. So, Dr. Shore, in your clinical experience or even in your research, have you noticed any gender-based differences in the ways that boys and girls experience or encounter loneliness?
Yes, I have. And what I found is that girls who are autistic or have ADHD or other conditions tend to be better at social interaction, better at masking, as Danielle was talking about. And masking can become a big component. And boys will do it too. The important thing about masking is that it's vital to educate the neurodivergent person as to what masking is and when they're masking, and so that they have a choice as to whether they mask. So in other words, how do I know, when do I need to mask, and do I want to mask for this situation? Because everybody masks at work, at home. We behave differently, whether we're in school, at home, in the community, and with various people, and that's okay. And if it's done with a considered understanding, then that can be much better. Another aspect of gender differences is how loneliness is interpreted between genders by other people, such as educators, therapists, parents, and others. And if we just think about the female, whether it's a young girl in a classroom, or it could be an adult who doesn't talk much, keeps to themselves, most of the time society will just say, oh, the girl or the woman is just shy, and they go along their merry way. A boy who behaves in this manner will be noticed, and something may be done about it. So that's also an important aspect to consider.
All right, thank you, Dr. Shore. So, Danielle, how can parents and caregivers help children with learning differences become empowered to embrace their unique abilities, their unique personalities, to be able to better navigate the social cues and kind of escape loneliness, I guess?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think one of the most important parts that parents and families can do to help their children is being able to focus on those positive qualities and making sure that um, that it's not just a lot of times we tend to view learning differences or any particular disability from the deficit model, right, and the medical model, where you're only looking at the skill deficits and challenges. However, a part of the developmental process and helping a child develop a positive self-concept is also focusing on their strengths and being able to allow a child to be able to make choices and being able to allow them to express themselves in a way that helps them with the emotional regulation, right? Which also plays into making sure that you're creating an environment where they feel safe, where those feelings are safe to be talked about, and that allows for them to also process those feelings in a way that's much more constructive.
Okay. So, Marissa, I wanted to get into your bailiwick a little bit. Can you talk to us about how creative arts can help neurodivergent children kind of bridge this social gap and avoid and combat loneliness?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a creative arts therapist, I obviously believe that creative arts can save the world because there's just so many ways that it is so impactful for both people who are neurodivergent and people who are neurotypical. One of the easiest things is that it can be something that is done together, right? So let's say you're using music. It's like a low stakes interaction because if you're in a band or you're playing an instrument, you're with others and you're creating something together that doesn't require that you have to give a piece of your emotional self, which can actually be quite hard and sometimes exhausting for those of us who are neurodiverse. So there's that aspect of it. My days back in the hospital when I worked in inpatient, some of the most wonderful groups we ever had were open art groups where you would come and you would color and we would listen to music and just be together in a space. And so I think using the creative arts, number one, can take that pressure off to be engaging with other people all the time. But it also adds something that I think people who tend to be neurodiverse engage in with the most ease, which is kind of like parallel play. In development, there's a time where children, they love to play. They don't want to play with you. They want to play next to you. And a lot of us who are neurodivergent, we kind of hang on to that. I want to be doing my own thing right next to you. And I feel very connected, but we don't actually have to engage. And that's one way that different types of arts can be really helpful for people who are neurodivergent. But the other way that I think maybe a lot of people don't deeply understand is that the creative arts, especially used as a therapeutic tool, can provide something that we call a projective technique. And it means that it's a way to discover self-expression that doesn't necessarily have to be verbal. So that's the other thing. A lot of people who are neurodiverse, we tend to have dyslexia or other expressive receptive language disorders that makes our ability to verbalize in a way that makes sense our internal experience kind of hard. So being able to sit down with, let's say, a creative arts therapist or even a friend and do an art project and make something that is an expression of what you're feeling that day because you can't put it into words, that can be very, very healing because you're allowed to see what your own experience is without having the pressure of having to talk about it and therefore in some way be automatically judged, right? Because beauty is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to art and things like that. So those are really the two main ways that creative arts therapy can be helpful. It brings people together without that intense need for the actual social interaction, but it also is just a new and a deeper way for people who are neurodiverse to communicate. Because one other thing is, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but most people who are neurodiverse, we are extremely creative. We are out of the box thinkers. Our minds can go to many different places very quickly. And so to have this beautiful structure of either a piece of clay or a piece of music or even some movement in a dance, to be able to express ourselves and think about things, those are really invaluable for people who are neurodiverse.
All right, thank you. So, Dr. Shore, we're solution-oriented here. So, can you share with us some proven clinical or research-driven strategies that parents and caregivers can do at home to help their neurodivergent children develop social skills and build genuine connections with their peers?
Yeah, I certainly can. And there are many strategies that are out there that are backed by research, that are backed by strongly considered thoughts. And these are, we can think of them as social narratives, which help explain why we do certain things socially, and also strategies insofar as how. And that is so important, how, the strategies, how to socially interact, because what I find is that most neurodivergent individuals want to socially interact. And the question is, how do we socially interact? And for for many people who are neurodivergent who say they don't want to interact, what I find is that if we go into their history, there's been a lot of negative reactions, a lot of negative experiences in attempting to socially interact with classmates, which then went badly, resulted in a lot of bullying or other ostracization of them in school. And so then the neurodivergent person feels, well, this social interaction thing, it's not really worth it. It's not cracked up to what people say it is. So I'm just not going to bother, and I don't want to do it because the experience will probably be poor. So some of the strategies include, for example, Social Stories by Carol Gray, which focus on providing strategies and giving reasons why we engage in certain types of social interaction. So there may be a social story, for example, on why we go to the dentist. Most children don't want to go to the dentist. I don't know many adults who like to go either. There's some. So most of us understand why we need to go to the dentist and get our teeth taken care of. And a social story will help explain why we need to go. And then, too, what are some strategies to make it a successful appointment? Similarly, cartooning. So using the model of a cartoon or a comic strip in which to have two types of bubbles above the character's head. One is what is actually being said, and then above that, what is actually being thought. So one child to another might say, "What's up, dog?" And the child who takes this literally is thinking, "Wait a minute, why is my classmate calling me a dog? I'm not a dog." And then above that, there might be some explanation as to calling somebody a dog is just a slang way of referring to a classmate or a friend. Role playing can be very helpful. Something that I do is I might have people who I work with hunt for YouTube videos focusing on a certain aspect that we're working on. So, for example, many autistic people and others who are people who are otherwise neurodivergent may tend to monologue about their favorite subject. So maybe I might monologue about something I'm interested in, such as music or bicycles or something else, way longer than I should, and people get bored. So we might have a discussion about that, and then I'll give some homework and say, now go on YouTube or some other video source and find 3 examples of where one person is talking for too long about something and not giving the other person a chance to talk. And then find some more YouTube videos that show where people are talking for a more appropriate amount of time and there's back and forth communication. Another example of a social narrative are power cards, which sort of take social stories to the next level, where there'll be a short story about a person who the person might be interested in. So if a student, and this happened with me with a music student I had, who was an amazing pianist. And he wanted to, one day he decided he wanted to play the trumpet. And so, okay, let's get him a trumpet. And I showed him how to play the first note, the note G. And then he played it. But what I didn't take into account is that one, the child had perfect pitch, and two, a trumpet is known as a transposing instrument, which means that you see a G, you play a G, but a different pitch is going to come out of the bell. It's going to be the note F. And he heard that, and he said, wait a minute, you are a liar, the trumpet's a liar, the music is a liar, and he had a meltdown, and we couldn't finish the lesson. So I had to go home and concoct a story about how Beethoven, and he was very interested in Beethoven's music, would also had a lot of trouble with what is known as transposing instruments. Again, an instrument, the musician sees a note, plays that note, but a different pitch comes out of the bell. And that Beethoven would have these horrific meltdowns when that occurred, and he'd beat up the concertmaster and his orchestra, and he'd throw the music stand into the musical ensemble, and he'd smash up his piano. However, Beethoven realized that this was not a good way to behave, and if he wanted to continue conducting his orchestra, he needed to come up with some calming strategies whenever he would get anxious about when thinking about transposing instruments. And some of those calming strategies could be to take a break, listen to favorite music, or something to keep him calm down. This gets all summarized on a small card, which then the child can refer to. So these are just some of the many strategies that are available for helping with social interaction.
All right, Dr. Shore, thank you for that. So Danielle, Dr. Shore has whetted my appetite for strategies. So I'm wondering, can you share some strategies about how parents and caregivers can, at home, help their neurodivergent children build some self-confidence and assertiveness that will help to promote better social interactions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one in which I think one of the most important strategies is allowing the child to take ownership in deciding what type of activities they want to be a part of. So you might ask your child to write down a few activities, and then also with that, when they identify what activities they'd like to participate in, maybe ask them if they can foresee any potential challenges with. So that way they begin to kind of reflect upon what might be difficult. And then the other part of it too is, as Dr. Shore had mentioned, is role playing is really significant. If you're able to role play different social scenarios with your child, and then also provide that constructive feedback. We can't expect someone to grow if we don't provide them with that feedback to grow, right? And then another important strategy that parents might consider too is also look at, maybe there's a lot of great mentoring programs that, just having someone who can empathize with your child and also reinforce some of those positive social behaviors. I can't stress that enough. That's really important. And then, as also Dr. Shore had mentioned, particularly with modeling, making sure that if you are expecting your child to have positive social behaviors, then make sure that you're also modeling that for them, because they are definitely observing that and absorbing that. So those are definitely just some strategies, but there's definitely lots of different ways that we can help encourage and empower children and young adults to have those positive social relationships. So.
All right. So Marissa, are there any long-term impacts or implications on neurodivergent children who are experiencing childhood loneliness? And if so, how does early intervention come into play to mitigate that?
Mm-hmm. There is so much. So if we don't intervene early, and let's say particularly with women, women tend to be more adaptable and mask, as we've heard here. And it makes it harder for the, your neurodivergence to get caught. And so what ends up happening is that as you age, you can develop many mental health issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, eating issues, right? I'm finding that a lot of people who have eating disorders, it's directly related to our sensory dysregulation and our neurodivergence. So there are a lot of long-term things. There could eventually be some type of substance use or screen addiction. Any type of addiction later down the line that becomes a form of self-soothing because we haven't learned those self-regulation skills for our bodies. So early intervention is, I cannot express enough, it's probably one of the most important things to help children who are neurodivergent or adults who are neurodivergent, kind of have the best outcome possible. So the way I like to look at it is like everybody has their own spectrum of existence. And if you are falling off your own spectrum to the point where your anxiety or your depression, or even something as simple as like difficulty eating food in some places because of smells, textures, things like that. If you're falling off your own spectrum and having difficulty and less ease in life, then that's an indication that some type of treatment is going to be really helpful for you. So I would say for parents of young children, if you're having children from birth through 5 years old that have a harder time self-soothing, let's say in the toddler years, your child's tantrums last like a good half hour and they have a hard time self-soothing or settling and going to bed at night, or feeding is an issue, absolutely have your child evaluated by a professional, because the earlier we can intervene, what then happens is that with something like, let's say, occupational therapy, we are teaching the sensory system how to integrate itself, how to regulate itself, and how to behave. And then that foundation makes it so much easier for children to learn about emotions, about themselves, and how they choose to express their emotions as they go through life. Because if you're living in a body that's dysregulating and having a lot of anxiety or panic, and you're kind of living in fight or flight mode, there's only so much learning that's going to help you make the right choices if your body's being very loud. So that's why early intervention is key, because we want to try and help people who are neurodivergent grow with bodies that are much easier regulated. And then from there, we do all the mental health work of like, this is you, and this is how you experience your anxiety, and here's the things that work for you. So I'd say early intervention is imperative. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean terrible things are going to happen. It just means that, it might take a little bit longer for that work to settle in and for patterns to change because you're older, right? When you're younger, your body and brain just learn so quickly. So that's one reason why early intervention is really one of the most important things we can offer people who are neurodivergent.
All right, so Dr. Shore, you get to put a bow on our conversation. Can you share with us how families and caregivers can create an open and supportive home environment where neurodivergent children can have honest conversations about loneliness and other social setbacks they may be experiencing?
Yeah, well, this is a very important question because children spend more time with their families than anywhere else. And what I've seen in my own family, with my parents, and with others, is that the best environment that one can have for a child is like with my parents, who accepted me for who I was, but at the same time also realized that a lot of work would be needed in order for me to lead a fulfilling and productive life. And so my parents, we would talk about my strengths and abilities using an ability strength approach and mindset. And at the same time, we would realize that there were many strategies that I needed to learn and a lot of work that needed to go in if I were to be successful in socially interacting with others, which then leads to a fulfilling and productive life, which we should make the rule rather than the exception for the neurodivergent population.
All right, that'll be our final word today. Danielle Hyder, Marissa Manzanares, and Dr. Stephen Shore. Thank you for the knowledge.